These are the fighters that just don't get enough credit for their careers. And that billing applies so heavily to the great Frank Shamrock. Although his brother Ken is the guy who people think of first, Frank was actually the far more impressive fighter at championship level. And when he won the very first UFC light heavyweight championship belt in 1997, he managed to carve out a run of real stability as champ, defending the title 4 times, including a fight of the year against Tito Ortiz. Shamrock didn't actually lose his title in the octagon either, going unbeaten before vacating his belt and retiring. He fought and won another 2 times in the next 6 years, but then suffered his first defeat in 9 years against Renzo Gracie due to DQ. He then joined Strikeforce, where he won once, broke his arm against Hung Lee, and got destroyed by Nick Diaz before actually calling it quits. So why don't you hear more about this MMA legend? Well, he and Dana White really hate each other, so Shamrock was effectively scrubbed from the history books. Igor Vovchanchin was a small heavyweight by any standard. In fact, at 5'8", he'd be on the shorter side for a lightweight. But to this day, Vovchanchin owns the second longest unbeaten streak in the sport's history with 37 wins. He also has the second most KOs in MMA history with 41. Despite being the same height as Dominic Cruz, he fought Fedor, Krokop, Overeem, Rampage, the Karaba, and many, many more. Indeed, he fought in an era of pride where there were some legit all-time greats operating on a level above him. But Igor was an absolutely nightmarish matchup for 90% of heavyweights in that period of time. Vovchanchin was a truly unique talent, that's for sure. It's hard to be number 2, but for Joseph Benavidez, 11 years he spent in the top flight before the eventual 3-fight losing streak that led to his retirement. He only lost to champions, Demetrius Johnson twice, the bantamweight champ Dominic Cruz twice, and then later the future Bellator champ Sergio Pettis. He posted a 20-5 record that contained wins over some of the best flyweights of his era, and though he did eventually fall into a slump in form, the fact that he was so good for so long really makes him one of the most underrated fighters of all time. It's not his fault he came up at the same time as Mighty Mouse. Remember, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single upload. Before Justin Gaethje carved out a reputation for himself as a bona fide bonus machine, we had Chris Little. To this day, no fighter in UFC welterweight history has managed to earn more performance bonuses. Little had 10 during his time in the UFC. He managed to endear himself to the fans in a huge way because of his gutsy performances. He also beat some excellent fighters too, like Dan Hardy, Matt Serra, and Matt Brown twice, among others. And considering how much of an action fighter he was, he also knew when to call it a day, retiring on a win over Dan Hardy that nettled him Fight of the Night and Submission of the Night honors. Hell of a career. Take one look at the resume of Rafael dos Anjos, the guys he has fought over the last decade or so, and how well he's done across 2 different weight classes. That should tell you everything you need to know about this inclusion here. Dos Anjos was turning in some of the all-time great championship-level performances during his title run, and if you need any further proof, just take a look at what he did to Anthony Pettis to win the belt. RDA was an amazing pressure fighter during his peak, but perhaps the most impressive thing about his career is just how long he managed to sustain it. To this day, RDA remains a top 15 fighter, despite him being just a matter of months away from his 40th birthday. Dos Anjos is a true icon of the lightweight white classes. Speaking of fighters who also fit that billing, Benson Henderson is one of the most underrated lightweights to ever lace up gloves. His run in the WEC was incredibly memorable, and his clash with Anthony Pettis prior to the promotion being absorbed by the UFC was an instant classic. But Bendo then went on to take his skills to the very top of the UFC too, winning promotional gold in the process. Henderson was an excellent wrestler, an amazing athlete, and was something of an innovator within the sport at the time. He was firing off calf kicks long before they became such a widely used part of the mainstream game. His ability to extend his career into his Bellator run across 2 different weight classes was highly commendable. Benson Henderson was one hell of a fighter during his peak. No list like this one would be complete without him. Eddie Alvarez caps off our run of underrated lightweight greats with a career that saw him win promotional gold in pretty much every company he fought for during his best years. The Underground King might be best known to casual fans for losing in a completely one-sided beatdown against Conor McGregor, but there was so much more to Eddie than that one loss. Eddie was gritty and tough. His greatest attributes? Yes, but he was also a lot more technically sound than he gets credit for. He fought some of the finest fighters of his generation, and he managed to beat a lot of them too. He was the first man to get the better of Justin Gaethje. Took the title off of the great Rafael dos Anjos, and he also holds wins over Roger Huerta, Shinya Aoki, Michael Chandler, Gilbert Melendez, Anthony Pettis, and many more. Eddie's an easy pick for the top 10 lightweights of all time. There is no fighter in UFC history who has the type of longevity that the former heavyweight champion Andrei Arlovski has carved out. He debuted 25 years ago, made it to the UFC just under 24 years ago, and aside from a 5-year spell outside the promotion, he's been on the roster ever since, spending 2.5 decades in the fight sport game is difficult at any weight class, but the fact that Arlovsky's been able to extend his career for so long at heavyweight is truly insane. You just can't make the same type of mistakes at heavyweight that you can get away with in other divisions, and Arlovsky's ability to act as a gatekeeper for the top 15 has shocked us time and time again. There are very few fighters in the history of this sport who have managed to rebound from several terrible runs of form and still manage to find themselves racking up wins. Arlovsky's in a category of his own in that department. We all know that the Korean zombie, Chan Sung-Jung, is among the most exciting fighters in MMA history, but what gets lost sometimes is just how talented he was and how far he managed to extend his skills. Jung was a WEC standout who came into the UFC and scored the first ever twister submission in the promotion's history, and he did that in his debut. Who can forget his Fight of the Year winning showdown with Dustin Poirier, which he won by way of DRC choke. Sure, he lost to Jose Aldo in his first title fight, but he then managed to rebound from a 3-year absence from the sport due to military service by displaying a newfound level of punching power. Jung was right up there for the entirety of the rest of his career, retiring after a title shot against Volkanovski and then a spirited effort against Max Holloway that, even though it ended in an ugly fashion for him, proved just how minimally Jung had slipped even as he aged. Finally, we come to a pick that might seem like an odd choice to some, and that's kind of the point. BJ Penn's downfall is without question the most dramatic turn we've ever seen from a legit GOAT-level fighter. But after watching those losses pile up, we can't realistically even talk about the prodigy as a top 10 or maybe even top 15 fighter of all time. But when BJ was good, he was just about as good as you could get, and his UFC title captures in 2 different weight classes proves it. He could box with the best of them and somehow managed to get his BJJ black belt in just 3 years and became the first non-Brazilian to win the World Jiu-Jitsu Championships in Rio de Janeiro. If you haven't watched Penn in his prime, you gotta check him out.